imagine it's a Thursday night. You're at a sleepover with your boys or your girls. There's one thing and one thing only. You have to beat the last level in Kindom Hearts. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Are you going to do it? What are you playing on? You're playing on the PlayStation, and you're about to learn the history of the PlayStation with Off the Top Podcast. What's up, everybody? I'm Julian. Jordan, how you doing?
Doing excellent, man. I can't wait to talk about something that's been a big part of my childhood and kind of go through the iterations of time as I grew up and as it grew up and as our listeners grew up. They know where they were at when the PlayStation X dropped, or they knew where they were at when they were playing PS2. So I'm excited to go through this with everybody.
Easily the biggest console of my childhood or generation. Maybe if I was born a few years later, it would have been Xbox, but PlayStation is where my heart is. PlayStation 2 is where it'll always be. And it's very interesting to see where the idea for the PlayStation was essentially founded early on in 1988.
Sony wanted to get into video games, and not specifically video games, but they kind of wanted to break into the CD-ROM space that was kind of being cultivated and still not, above VHS and cartridges as far as games, but they definitely wanted to get their hands dirty. So what they did, which is kind of a very interesting take nowadays, if you think about what these two titans fight against each other in some sort of way do in the console game. But Sony and Nintendo started a collab to develop something they called the Super Disc.
And it's so surprising knowing what we know now about this deal. So Sony and Nintendo are working together. They're on the cutting edge. They're working on this CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo. And during this, you know what? Nintendo says, all right, Sony, I think we're going to go work with Philips. And what I know Philips has today is a couple electronics like washers and dryers and maybe a couple TVs. But I was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is the chance of a lifetime. So PlayStation says, all right, Nintendo, you played your cards that way. We'll play our cards this way. And Sony kind of decided to move on with this iteration, and where eventually they went on to make the first PlayStation, which there was only 200 models produced, and this could play Nintendo cartridges and could also play like audio CDs and read CDs with video.
Yeah, a very interesting move by Nintendo. And I think the reason why, jumping kind of like getting a little bit more into it, is because Sony had a really sweet deal when it came to their agreement with Nintendo. They got to work on basically the CD and CD-ROM like technology and licensing, and they relegated Nintendo to manufacture the cartridges. So obviously they kind of, it seemed like, from their, I'm sure, standpoint, they had a very fair deal, but not according to Nintendo. And so that backstabbing kind of spurred Sony on to kind of go on a little bit of a tear when it comes to, when they started creating video games. And after their kind of like their interesting little Frankenstein baby monster, whatever you would like to call it, they started jumping into the PlayStation X, or now what we know or consider as like the PlayStation 1.
Exactly. And that's 1994. The PlayStation X is announced. And if you can't think of it now, or the PlayStation 1, it's this very slim gray console. You have 2 controller inputs. It was released obviously with no Nintendo compatibility. And it essentially, ended up selling over 300,000 units in the first month. It was a huge hit for consoles in 1994.
The reason why it was such just a massive thing in the console world is because if you look at this guy, it kind of did everything that you would love a console to do, especially starting out. It had a 32-bit processor, which, I mean, yeah, granted, guys, okay, let's think of this in 1994 time. A CD-ROM, and just was cheaper and more powerful than any other console on the market as far as, what they were competing with. And another thing, too, is around this time, Sony started acquiring some real big dogs in the game as far as development goes with Konami, Namco, and more. So they kind of got the really, really hot start when it comes to just having a great console, and then having people just making, or like really, really talented development teams making these great games to come with it. And fast forward to now the PlayStation 1 was the first console to sell over 120 million units. And granted, it took a decade, but still, what a feat.
Truly phenomenal, because those 300,000 units we talked about beforehand were only in Japan. It was later unveiled in 1995 in the US. And, it took them 8 years to get to 100 million units, and then 2 more years to hit a fifth of that and get another 20 million. And the thing that I found so interesting was that obviously this is pre-internet. So if you wanted to play on 2 TVs with a friend, PlayStation used to have the link cable. So you'd link your PlayStations together. They would link to the TV. So essentially a LAN party to play with, 4 players on 2 screens, or however you wanted to set it up, which was the ultimate friendship camaraderie time, seeing there was no internet or online play or Google Stadia at that point.
Those LAN parties got hot and heavy. I'm telling you what, Julian. Never been to one, but I just imagine that's what it was like, by the way. So yeah. And granted, the PS1 wasn't always just taking trophies left and right. There happened to be a little bit of overheating issues when it came to the console. And so that's something that Sony had to work out themselves. But another cool thing, getting back on the things that they were doing right when it comes to PS1, was that they had a really, really cool edition of the PS1 that was just matte black, and it was called the Yorose version, which gave people a development kit to create their own games. And if you can imagine that, they were kind of giving the tools over to the people at that point and saying, go for it, create whatever game you think you can with this thing. And, having a very supportive role in the community and, encouraging people to go out there and use their PlayStation to, create video games, which I think was a very, it might have been a subtle play, but a very, very powerful one, in the fact that they kind of gave the power to the people, and the people really embraced them for that.
And seeing that power that they gave to their consumers, and also providing, as Jordan said, some major developers early on, you create some lasting memories. And some of the first games on the PlayStation that really took off, I bet you've played one of these 3 games. One of the games was Crash Bandicoot. The other game was Tomb Raider. And then you also have Metal Gear Solid. So I'm going to say there's a very good chance you have a memory playing this game, or watching someone play this game as a child, or going to that friend's house to play, Crash Bandicoot or Tomb Raider or Metal Gear Solid. And you kind of create that lifetime customer acquisition connection to the PlayStation.
Julian, that just kind of brought some nostalgia back for sure. Because, I definitely, growing up, those 3 games definitely had a presence in my childhood. And to this day, here's something that I don't think anybody knows about me except my listeners and you. I still, to this day, Spyro the Dragon was a huge game for me, and I loved it. I watched my dad play it. I played it, and obviously I watched him play a whole bunch of video games. But to this day, if ever I just have just want to, I'm doing work, either I'm programming or, doing something, and I want a little bit of background noise, I will put on the Spyro the Dragon soundtrack and just let it go and just be in the zone. So, definitely Sony has worked their way into, my nostalgia pockets of my mind, and I love it that way.
And you can see, why PlayStation's been so successful. Their timing in the market was great, but not only to have a great first product, the second product they came out with, not including the Pocket Station because that was kind of a flop, a little too early on for mobile gaming, but the PlayStation 2 is unveiled in 2000, which changed the game.
Absolutely. Well, just so that we can kind of jump right into kind of like what they came to offer. So they had backwards compatibility. It was the best seller with over 155 million units sold. And another thing that was just gorgeous about it is I'll go through a list. Metal Gear Solid, Jack and Daxter, Kingdom Hearts, God of War, Gran Turismo, Crash Bandicoot, etc. And so they continued to check their competitors when it came to the PS2.
And not only did they do this great jump to bring in more games, the PS2 could stand horizontally and vertically. It could play DVDs. The controller that they added, the second iteration of the DualShock, gave greater mobility, greater input, greater user enjoyment overall to make the experience as wholesome as possible. And so they're doing all these things and bringing in high definition graphics, which was, I think, 1080p at the time, and really stepping that bar up as technology advanced to make sure that, the customers that already loved PlayStation continued to play, but also brought in that next generation of gamers and the next generation for years to come.
If it's one thing that me and Sony know for a fact is that people like to be able to do it laying down and people like to be able to do it standing up. And so I see you out there, Sony. But once again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there was also kind of another mix-up or unfortunate happening for Sony. They did get stuck with a 2002 lawsuit when it came to basically the premise of this lawsuit is that they were giving consumers faulty consoles. And so they were working through that as well. But, I feel like a small speed bump in the road of Sony and PlayStation. And then they obviously dropped the PlayStation 2 Slim in 2004, which did away with kind of the big chunkiness of it, but also allowed a Ethernet jack to basically signal that Sony's thinking about the online game playing scene and how that's going to be important in the future. And was Sony right?
Yeah, it's crazy what they're doing. I mean, people's love for Sony was so strong that Dan Holmes in the UK legally changed his name to Mr. PlayStation 2 Dan. Literally changed his name to Mr. PlayStation 2 Dan, which is a huge commitment. But, he said he'd spent already over like 10,000 euros on games in the first 2 years that the console existed, which I found was phenomenal. And another fun fact that I actually just learned while doing research for this was, if you've played the PlayStation 2, it has a historic loading screen. You know what it is. You get the sounds, you see these towers shooting up. And I actually learned today that those towers that you see shooting up are assigned with saved game data based on your memory card. So the more towers you're seeing on there, the more saved game data you have on those memory cards. And essentially, this was to help tell if data was being detected by the PlayStation, or there may be some troubleshooting errors that need to be looked into.
Wow. I did not know that. And I think that's really clever on PlayStation's or Sony's part to be doing that. And as we see going further on down the road, they once again, they do something big and they drop the PS Vita, which once again was kind of, I think, ahead of its time when it came to portable gaming in itself.
Yeah, I had a PSP for a little while. It was cool. It was just a little ahead of its time, a little too much for mobile gaming. But I definitely enjoyed it. And then they announced another great follow-up product.
Exactly. So they dropped the PS3, and this guy had a Blu-ray optical disc drive, which I think was once again ahead of its time, because at this time Blu-ray was kind of this niche thing where you got a higher quality out of your DVDs, as if they were Blu-ray, so that they were really pushing for advanced technology and intertwining their gaming system with almost an entertainment system. The unfortunate part about the PS3 is that there was a noticeable groan when it came to the system being underpowered, and unfortunately with the combo of being overpriced. Sometimes, at the beginning stages of this thing, people were actually like laughing at what PlayStation was doing or weren't taking them seriously at all when it came to the PS3.
And to what Jordan was saying about, the Blu-ray compatibility, is that if you remember Blu-ray when it was poppin', you needed a specific Blu-ray player instead of a regular DVD player at the time. You needed a specific Blu-ray player to play this. So, what my assumption is Sony and PlayStation see people are willing to pay extra to get a Blu-ray player. So if we put that Blu-ray player into our PS3, we can raise our price, keep, things to a similar standard. In this case, it ends up being a little underpowered and underperforming to some aspects. Try to pull a quick one, essentially, in terms of what we can do for our consumers. And, I think that's part of the reason why the PlayStation 3 kind of snuck behind at this time the Xbox 360 for a little bit, was for some of these reasons.
That's a good point, Julian. And you got to think that there's always this jockey of supremacy and dominance in the market, and jockey of kind of space when it comes to, these consoles duking it out. And another thing that I think kind of really royally shot Sony in the foot, which I'm going to get a little nerdy for you guys for a second, is their decision of a really, really quirky chipset in the PlayStation 3. So when it came to the PlayStation 3, the units that they used to basically process the power in their workhorses were designed by Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. And, I think first off, I think there was a too many cooks in the kitchen scenario going on with kind of like a three-headed dragon. And so when it came to the CPU, which is made up of like a 132 gigahertz PowerPC based power processing element, and then 8 synergetic processing elements. And the reason why that this was just kind of like a really goofy thing was because that chipset wasn't really something of the time at all. And it was kind of like this anomaly where it made it really difficult because it was on a different chipset than the previous generations, or even like, as far as architecture goes, it was totally different. And so what Sony had to do to kind of keep their backwards compatibility is work in the PS2's architecture into the PS3 so that it would be backwards compatible, and then do their own thing. And so what happened is that developers found it almost like stupid to architect for something that's so expensive to develop, because it was so niche and so like goofy in its own right. So with just the hurting of being underpowered and overpriced, there also wasn't that many great games coming out for the PS3 because developers didn't see it financially viable to start creating games for this thing that, was just so expensive to create for.
That's kind of, why that PS3 dropped off for a little bit. As Jordan mentioned, it kind of got really convoluted on a developer side, and just underperforming. The PS3 had, if I remember correctly, had some features tried to either additions or features built in to, if you guys remember this trend, to help for 3D TVs. So if that 3D TV trend were to catch on, you'd be able to play some of those games with the stereoscopic glasses and 3D specific glasses. That just never really caught on, so never really was utilized. But oddly enough, the PS3 won an Emmy. Didn't know they gave out Emmys for these, for their DualShock 3 controller. So the third iteration of the DualShock 2 analog controller. And this Emmy was for technological impact. So how they, adjusted this controller for sensitivity and user engagement and accuracy and speeds was worthy of an Emmy at the time. So, out of everything, maybe one good thing came out of the PS3 and they got an Emmy.
When it comes to that, they were also doing good things with the PSN network and kind of, bridging that gap when it came to being able to play online and, getting into the digital space when it comes to gaming and, having there be so many games on the PSN network that they could play and also be able to play like, reboots or not even just reboots, but, retro games as far as like PS1 games and PS2 games on there as well. So the PS3 went through about 3 versions of kind of getting just sleeker and smaller. And then something cool happened, and I'm sure Sony just enjoys thinking about it and talking about it. In 2011, the PSN network halted due to a huge hacking outage that targeted 77 million users and got most of all of their information held in their PSN profile.
Yeah, I remember that day on Twitter. I think these hackers called themselves the Lizard Squad. Just held the PSN and PlayStation hostage for a good period of time. And, after all these obstacles, 2013 rolls around. It's a new day. It's a new dawn. And the PS4 releases their latest console, or latest, I guess, number of console.
Yeah, exactly. And so this thing was kind of Sony step into the right direction. They shifted the chipset to something that actually made sense. They also kind of provided like a really cool updates when it came to actually the console itself, the controller once again, and definitely upped themselves back in the game with being kind of what they were known for. I mean, granted, not the cheapest, but like have a really powerful processor. And another thing I'm going to get called the chipset guy. I know this. But another thing that they did with the chipset that was really awesome was that they made it based off of kind of, well, let me just tell you the stats and then you tell me what this kind of sounds like to you. So they had a x86 AMD 8-core CPU block. And then they had a 1.84 teraflops AMD Radeon GPU, which was block packaged in the system on chip style thing. That sounds a lot like a laptop or a computer to me. And so what they were doing basically is they started creating their chipset over kind of like what would be really similar to a computer. So what that does to the developers is, oh shit, this is going to be really easy to develop for. We just kind of did something when we created this computer game. So Sony, once again, redeeming themselves in a very cool way and opening themselves up to so many developers now being able to and almost wanting to create and develop games on their PS4.
Word to chipset. But they also introduced, HDR gameplay. There's social media features where you could share games in moments super, super quick. Great user interface. Really caught up for its slacking behind Xbox for a while. And now things are getting pretty even between PlayStation, Xbox, depending on what side you're on. People are really starting to enjoy just being able to play games on either console. Jordan, off the top of your mind, no particular order. Doesn't have to be a hard list, but if you could think of your top 4 PlayStation games, what would they be?
Damn, Julian, that's a good question. I would say not in any particular order. I think that, gosh, dang, man, you put me on the spot here. You know what? I'm going to go with, Spyro the Dragon. We've already talked about what that is about. Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater. Dragon Ball Z, Budokai 3. I don't mess with any of that Tenkaichi shit. And I'm going to save my last one. And this sounds lame. I can't think of one, but if I do, I'm going to drop it randomly, probably in the middle of this podcast. How about you, Julian?
I'm going to say over the period of the PlayStation, my games I enjoyed was the Jak and Daxter series. Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank. I'm going to combine those. I liked Psychonauts. I liked Kindom Hearts, and I liked I think it was Sly Fox or Sly Cooper.
Sly Cooper.
Yeah, and those are primarily PS2 games. PS2 just killed it. So those are my top 4. There's probably a ton I'm missing, like NBA Street, Guitar Hero, Gran Turismo, Midnight Club Dub Edition, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing here is that the best-selling game of all time with 18 million units is The Last of Us, more of a more modern game with a great storyline, very unique gameplay style, and decision making. And the greatest franchise of PlayStation history is Gran Turismo.
Honestly, both absolute and like certified bangers as far as I'm concerned. They could definitely absolutely make the top 4 list of anybody's gaming list who's kind of been around Sony and PlayStation. And I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to see why they wouldn't be. And if I could now remake my list, as I said I was, as convenient as you said, I am kicking off Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, putting in Kindom Hearts, and then leaving the last space for Gran Turismo / The Last of Us, because they're both excellent games. Sorry, all my DBZ fans. It was a thing that had to be made. Great game, but it can't stand up to Sora in the game.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast on the history of PlayStation. We also have a podcast on the history of Nintendo. So, those kind of link up in some aspects. And we also challenge you to send us, your top 4 PlayStation games, not in any order, on the spot. You can email us the off the top podcast at gmail.com or on social at off the top cast. Jordan, any parting trash talk for these PlayStation users?
Usually I would take this time to just absolutely ravage some people because my trash talk game is on point. But another thing, if you guys are interested in kind of the history of PlayStation, you will definitely pique your interest about the future of PlayStation and how the possibilities of it being extinct are becoming kind of scarily real after Google Stadia got dropped. And we just did a podcast on that, which you'll find on our channel. So if you are interested in kind of like gaming in general and seeing where the future of it's going, you definitely want to tune into that podcast itself. And once again, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, and game on.